That same January, the city government had released a report declaring that thanks to ill-informed, corrupt, and occasionally drunken coroners, murderers in New York were escaping justice in record numbers. Infanticide, for instance, was almost never punished, and skillful poisoning can be carried on almost with impunity. The report was conducted by the city's Commissioner of Accounts, a reform-minded zealot named Leonard Walstein. The commissioner had spent a full year studying the long-established political coroner system and concluded that it was a joke, a travesty, a disgrace, a public scandal, and a sheer waste of taxpayers' money. That was only the beginning of his list of epithets. He could add specific complaints about the coroner now in office, Patrick Reardon, who had been observed sneaking nips from his hip flask during recent criminal trials. 2 Manhattan civic clubs were demanding Reardon's removal from office. But Walstein's report, released in January 1915, was less concerned with the bad habits of one city coroner than with the failures of the whole system. The problems originated, he argued, in the fact that the coroner was an elected official. In New York City, political party bosses regularly fixed elections to reward loyal supporters with lucrative positions. The most powerful political machine in the state belonged to the Democratic Party, which kept headquarters in a rather modest 3-story brick building named Tammany Hall, situated on East 14th Street. The party bosses had occupied that home for so long, it was built in 1830, that many New Yorkers referred to the party machine itself as Tammany Hall. The political masterminds on East 14th Street had not put the clean government crusader Leonard Walstein into power, nor had Tammany Hall wanted him there. In a rare act of rebellion, city voters in 1914 had elected a mayor promising government reform. Walstein's coroner investigation, prompted in part by the actions of Patrick Reardon, fulfilled a promise made by the administration of Mayor John Perroy Mitchell. One of Mitchell's friends had become entangled in a scheme involving kickbacks between an undertaker and the coroner's department. The coroner system was only one example of the party machine's bad influence, Walstein said, but a particularly egregious one. Reardon, who held his position solely through Tammany Hall influence, was only the most obvious symptom of the system's ills. The commissioner estimated that the city spent $172,000 annually on unqualified coroners, their mediocre physicians, and their personal clerks, who spend most of their time on private affairs or on lining their pockets. In addition to drawing their salaries, coroners worked on commission. They could, and usually did, bill the city for everybody they examined. One assistant coroner investigated the same drowning victim more than a dozen times, claiming each time that it had bobbed up at a different location on the Hudson River. Coroners had been known to allow families to claim bodies only if they agreed to let a certain funeral home, which paid a kickback, handle the arrangements. Coroners had other sources of income as well. They sold fake death certificates and thereby covered up murders, criminal abortions, and suicides. One of Walstein's favorite examples involved a man who had been found dead in his bed, with a bullet wound in his mouth and a revolver in his right hand. The gun contained 3 loaded cartridges and 1 exploded one. The coroner gave the cause of death as rupture of thoracic aneurysm. The city required no medical background or training for coroners, even though they were charged with determining cause of death. The list of New York City coroners from 1898 to 1915 included 8 undertakers, 7 politicians, 6 real estate dealers, 2 saloon keepers, 2 plumbers, a lawyer, a printer, an auctioneer, a woodcarver, a carpenter, a painter, a butcher, a marble cutter, a milkman, an insurance agent, a labor leader, and a musician. It also included 17 physicians, but these, Walstein pointed out, were men like Patrick Reardon, doctors who had lost their practice and turned to a political position. None of them were asked to pass a test in order to hold office or exhibit any knowledge of the profession. As a result, Walstein found, death certificates were filled out with no effort at determining cause. Among the entries were, could be suicide or murder, and either assault or diabetes. In one instance, a coroner had attributed death to diabetes, tuberculosis, or nervous indigestion. A few death certificates simply read, "Act of God." This was not, of course, a uniquely New York problem. A survey by the National Research Council concluded that the average coroner anywhere in the United States was an untrained and unskilled individual, popularly elected to an obscure office for a short term, with a staff of mediocre ability and inadequate equipment. The Research Council recommended that all coroner systems be abolished. It is an anachronistic institution which has conclusively demonstrated its incapacity to perform the functions customarily required of it. In his own jurisdiction, Walstein asked the Health Department to analyze 800 cases, randomly chosen from piles of coroner reports. The doctors there discovered that almost half the certificates were so random in their conclusions, or so wrong, that there is a complete lack of evidence to justify the certified cause of death. Some coroners didn't bother to fill out death certificates at all, just signing them and turning them in. Even so, the Health Department reported it had waited 3 years for some certificates to be filed. Not surprisingly, Walstein discovered that the city's district attorneys often tried to avoid working with coroners, since these bungling so-called experts could easily undermine a prosecution. No wonder, he wrote, that poisoners and other criminals had it so easy in the year 1915. One might expect to find poor equipment and poorly educated criminal investigators in a small village, he added, but New York City is compelled to get along virtually without aid from the science of legal medicine, a situation which exists in no other great city of the world. In retrospect, the Moores case illustrated his points almost perfectly. The suspect claimed that he'd been able to kill some of his chosen victims in just a few minutes, but the coroner had informed the prosecutor that that couldn't be true, that it took at least 10 minutes for chloroform to kill a person. Based on that information, the prosecutor hesitated to believe the confession. Yet the scientific journals supported Moore's confession. One study of 52 chloroform deaths, done only a few years earlier, found that 4 people had died in less than a minute, and 22 of them had died in less than 5 minutes. The coroner also assured the prosecutor that there was no way to find chloroform in a corpse, especially after a burial. Based on this information, the district attorney had refused to exhume a single body. Instead, he declared that it was impossible to find even a full quart of chloroform in a dead body, that an autopsy was a waste of time since it would yield no evidence. Again, the existing science said almost exactly the opposite. Chloroform not only withstands but also impedes putrefaction, said a leading toxicology book. In animals killed with chloroform, the compound could be detected in their tissues at least 4 weeks after death. In the brain, where it tended to concentrate, it could be found months after death. Further, the burying of a body tended to prevent the volatile compound from evaporating. Contrary to the confusion created by the Rice trial, toxicologists were clear that chloroform was definitely an irritant. People who swallowed chloroform, and lived to tell the tale, were shocked by the burn in the mouth. Autopsy showed that chloroform left the mucous membranes of the mouth, stomach, and intestines reddened and inflamed. The poison was caustic enough that the skin lining the throat and pharynx was visibly softened, easily peeling loose at just a light touch of a pathologist's gloved fingers. And whether chloroform was inhaled or swallowed, it left a betraying signature. It darkened the blood and caused it to gather in the brain, lungs, liver, and kidneys, producing clumps of bulbous, overfull blood vessels. Chloroform victims could be slightly yellow in color, showing signs of jaundice, due to the poison's ability to wreak havoc in the liver. Alcoholics, with their often damaged livers, were among those most quickly killed by chloroform. They had been among the most frequent deaths under surgical anesthesia. Reasonable tests for chloroform in human tissue existed even at the time of Rice's death, and had been even better established by 1915. The following directions were available in the 1890s. A chemist should mince tissue, distill it with steam, then boil the resulting syrup with a mix of lye and benzene. If chloroform existed in the hot chemical soup, the liquid turned yellowish red, fluorescing, according to the textbooks, to a beautiful yellowish green if exposed to ultraviolet light. Other chemical tests could separate the poison into its basic constituents. A basic chloroform molecule consists of 5 atoms, 1 of carbon, 1 of hydrogen, and 3 of chlorine, clustered neatly together. If a chemist heated some minced tissue and added a destructive element, say hydrochloric acid, he could gradually break the poison apart, separating the chlorine from the rest of the solution, a process that would confirm the presence of chloroform. The Bronx coroner obviously didn't know this science, and if he sought advice from colleagues elsewhere in New York City, they were uninformed as well. But the possibility of chemical detection did actually exist in that frozen February when Frederick Moores walked into a police station to boast of murder, if anyone had bothered to look for it. The police found these scientific excuses infuriating. They believed that Moores was the murderer he claimed to be. The sheriff had said so publicly, infuriating the district attorney. In a press conference, the prosecutor conceded that it was probable that Moores had hurried the deaths of 8 people, maybe more. The police had discovered that another 9 deaths at the home appeared suspicious, but probability wasn't proof, and as they had no eyewitnesses, a suspect with diagnosed paranoid tendencies, and absolutely no evidence of poison in any of the bodies, the prosecutor decided that he could not justify taking the case to court. The Bronx district attorney stated, "Moore's fellow employees and others have given circumstantial evidence. They have told of deaths under suspicious circumstances. They have even told of smelling the odor of chloroform about Moore's person. But nothing they have said would be accepted by a judge or jury as proof of the fact that a crime had been committed in the manner described by Moore's." The prosecutor's office had released the Oddfellows Home superintendent from custody, citing lack of evidence that he conspired to eliminate residents in his care, but officials couldn't quite bring themselves to let go of Moores. The district attorney made some calls, pulled some strings, and ignoring the report from Bellevue that found him less than certifiable, had the suspected killer committed to an asylum, hoping to use the fact that he had been institutionalized as just cause to deport him back to Austria. Moores was sent to the Hudson River State Hospital for the Insane in Poughkeepsie. He had been there about 3 months when he learned of the deportation plan. A week before his scheduled removal, in May 1915, Moores walked away from the asylum, simply disappeared on a warm spring day. In response to an angry complaint, the director of the hospital pointed out that the asylum wasn't a home for the criminally insane, and that he'd been given no warnings about Moores when he'd admitted him. The staff hadn't considered him dangerous. His behavior had been what it was at Bellevue, polite, quiet, and maybe a little paranoiacally inclined, as Gregory had put it. But no one at the asylum had thought that he might be someone to keep locked away. Moores disappeared so completely that the police suspected that he'd once again changed his name. He'd been born in Austria with the name Milnerich. He'd explained the change carefully in that first confession, as he watched the detectives through the haze of cigarette smoke. He'd picked the new name for its meaning in Latin. It meant death. By the time Frederick Moores disappeared with the spring winds, the city and state governments had come to grim agreement. "It is clear," Leonard Walstein told the New York newspapers, "that the welfare of the city absolutely requires the immediate abolition of the elective coroner system." The governor, embarrassed by all the attention being given to corruption in the state's major city, demanded that Reardon step down from office. And the state legislature passed a bill that had been consistently defeated in earlier sessions, establishing a new medical examiner system for New York City. It required that the position be filled by a qualified doctor, one with pathology experience, who would need to pass stringent professional tests to get the job, and who would appoint a well-trained staff, the kind capable of building a case at least against a self-confessed murderer. The law had one catch, though. The clever politicians of Tammany Hall had built in a 3-year delay. The medical examiner system wouldn't become official until January 1918. The authors of the clause expected that by that time the reformers would be out of office, and the new mayor, well, he would damn well do as he was told.